Hey, Bruce here, Modern DriveLine. We have some quick tips for you today, and what we're doing is we're underneath a 66 Mustang with a 289 or a 302. I think in this case it's probably a 5-liter engine. And some of the things that we commonly get asked in the shop is the different flywheels, some of the pilots versus bearing, when I should grease, when I shouldn't grease, bolt patterns. How do I identify a 157 tooth flywheel versus a 164 tooth on small block Fords? So let's go over some of the features of this flywheel. Being that this is a 157, the way you can tell is on the ring gear face, the entire face of it, you can actually see from the friction side here of the flywheel. If you were to only see a portion of the ring gear, then you would have to slide the ring gear on from the opposite side. Being that the ring gear is slipped on from the friction side, we identify this as a 157. We don't need to count it. Ford, when they built these flywheels, on the smaller 157, they had plenty of room to put the pressure plate bolts in. Ford, when they had stuck the 11-inch long pattern in on the flywheel, they had to slide the ring gear in from the opposing side to give the pressure plate more thread area so it was over the ring gear itself. So that's a quick way of knowing. If you're pulling a starter out and you're looking at the ring gear from the opposing side, you can see the entire face of it, you know it's a 164 tooth. And you have to have the matching bell housing and starter for a 164 tooth and a matching bell housing and block plate for a 157. Some of the other tech tips that we have for you today is this happens to be what we call a metric pattern. It's a 10.5, some people call it 10.4. It has these safety pins. There's 3 of them throughout the flywheel. That helps align the pressure plate to the flywheel. These pins are referred to as safety pins because they're stepped. When the pressure plate is on it, the 5/16 base versus a 1/4 inch stem actually can retain the pin from popping out. So some people call these alignment pins, some people call them safety pins. Their job is to align the pressure plate. Noted with this is 8mm pressure plate bolts, okay? Those only are going to fit in here. If you're trying to put a 5/16 threaded bolt, which is similar in diameter, don't make the mistake and send those in and bind them up and snap your bolts. Now this particular flywheel is a cast flywheel. The cast flywheel here has these Mallory holes. These holes are not drilled on purpose so that you can push weighted material in here to change the weight of this flywheel rather than continuing to take more weight off. Now this particular flywheel, which is not shown here, is a 50-ounce flywheel. It is important that you take and put the correct flywheel on for the motor that you're building or running. So in this day and age, original 289, 260s, 302s up to 1980 were 28-ounce in balance. Now this particular motor being a 5-liter, it still sports a 50-ounce imbalance. So that was introduced in 1981 and it was run all the way to 1995 on current 5-liter Mustangs. Now, make sure they understand this is 5-liter HO and not Coyote. Modern DriveLine does offer a billet steel and cast 157 tooth flywheel where they would be dual drilled. So in these locations here, you would probably see something that is threaded with a shouldered area, recessed threads. So don't confuse the patterns. And if you are using a 10-inch long pattern, which was used prior to this 10.5-inch metric pattern, the pins are not used, they're pulled out, and then you would use only the 5/16 shouldered bolts in that case, okay? Other common questions that we get when I put flywheels on. You put a flywheel on, yeah, there are 5 holes here, people put the flywheel on, and then we get a call in the shop that says, hey, my flywheel doesn't fit. And we say to them, have you rotated it? And then the common question we get back is, yes, or why is that important? Well, the flywheels, to keep the balance in line with the crank indexed, is that one of these bolts is about 40 thousandths out of center. So you have to keep spinning it until all of these bolts here, all 6 of them, are aligned with each other. Now this particular flywheel, I believe this index mark here indicates the hole that is out of center or out of compared to the other 5. So when you're putting a flywheel on, make sure that you spin it around, get all the holes to line up, and you're golden. That will allow the counterweight to be aligned with the crank every time. Other things that we get for questions in the shop. This one happens to be a needle bearing, commonly used from the mid-70s all the way up through, including your modular motors and V6s. A question that we get in the shop is when you put the pilot bushing, or in this case pilot bearing, in, the shoulder of this sits proud off the crank. That is normal. As long as you send it in carefully, you'll hear the tone change, and then you'll know that that is all the way in. Make sure that you do grease this needle bearing. If it's dry, use your pinky, put some grease on it, run it in there. Don't get excessive, but make sure that it's good and wet. Roll it around, that way it's good. The little blue seal that you see there is helping keeping the grease in. Pilot bushing, common question we get. Don't grease a pilot bushing. If it's oil light, it's impregnated with oil, you do not put anything on those bushings. You're going to push them in. A lot of times the bushing will go all the way in until it hits the shoulder, and then you know that it's all the way into the crank. If for some reason your crank is a little deeper, just make sure to put the bushing in so it's flush with the end of the crank lip. And at that point you're basically done. So no material goes in there, no grease, no anti-seize, nothing goes in there. Crank bolts, common question that we get. What should I do here? Now this particular car is not exhibiting. This car has been run, and we actually have pulled it apart here to show you some of this tech tip stuff, and you can see that it's dry. This is what we want. Do not put like never seize on these bolts, because that material can wick itself out, and the next thing you know, it's on the friction surface of the flywheel. So these bolts are actually going through the crank into a wet hole. It's not blind, it's actually open. So it is important to put probably like a blue Loctite, or if you got ARP, they provide some lubricant, a moly material. As long as we're keeping the oil from wicking through the threads and making its way onto the flywheel, we are good, okay? Other things that we get asked about. 85 foot-pounds of torque is typically used on these 7/16 20 type bolts. I believe they're 7/16, yes, I believe they're 20s. So those are some of the quick tech tips that we have for you today. We hope that you found this to be helpful. If you have any further questions, feel free to give us a ring at moderndriveline.com. And our phone number is 208-453-9800. Thank you.